My daughter's doing Zoom classes. She's in 6th grade, for those of you who don't know. And she's doing Zoom classes. And so she's sitting at home listening to stuff, right? And one of her classes is science. Now, I was already a little bit suspicious of the science program because the first 2 weeks they just watched the Lorax. Not super sciencey. Okay. Right.
Carter, you crack me up. Okay.
Okay, you watched the Lorax. But I was being forgiving. I'm like, all right, look, I know they're lefties, they're environmentalists, and they're probably getting their crap together for the first couple weeks because they're discombobulated. So they watch the Lorax. I let that slide mostly. I'm like, all right, let's let it slide. They watch the Lorax. But then she says to me the other day, she comes up to me and she says, do you know about biomagnification? And I said, yeah, I know what biomagnification is. Just for those of you who don't know in the audience, biomagnification is what happens when there's a toxin at lower level in the food chain and things eat that thing with the toxin and something eats that and whatever, and you get a higher concentration of that toxin in the thing. So it's why you don't eat a lot of shark, for example. You'll get mercury poisoning if you eat too much shark because they're at the top of the food chain in the ocean, and any little bit of mercury in phytoplankton works its way up, right? In higher concentrations at each level. So I said, yeah, I know about biomagnification. And she said, oh, well, we learned about Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and DDT. And I said, really? You learned about Silent Spring as a valid book and her arguments against DDT as legitimate? And she said, yeah, that's what we learned. I almost lost it. And I knew in the back of my mind there were problems because I had read this in the past, but I went and found, by the way, great article. If you want to read this article by Robert Zubin, in the New Atlantist, if you're interested in DDT generally, I know it's an old topic, but it's called The Truth About DDT and Silent Spring. It's an excellent article. I'm just going to steal from it a little bit while I talk. I've taken some notes on it. So anything that I'm saying that's good is all his, and anything I'm saying that's wrong is probably my mistake. But I was like, okay, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about this because using Rachel Carson and using Silent Spring as an example of valid science is exactly the opposite of science. It's literally the best way to undermine science I can possibly think of. I'll try and be quick about this, but let me just give you a history.
Yeah, and explain it to someone like myself who has not read Silent Spring. So okay. I don't know anything you're about to say.
Okay. DDT was a miracle chemical, basically. It was a major factor in winning World War II. Like legitimately a factor. Like the Sicilian campaign of 1943, malaria killed more people than the Axis forces. DDT is a chemical that wipes out mosquitoes, basically, other bugs, but it kills mosquitoes. It was a godsend. Like it was instrumental in the liberation of Rome. It allowed the Allied forces to get through marshes that the Germans had allowed to be flooded again. Like it was a big deal. It worked in the Philippines to save lives. Huge deal in World War II. Huge deal. They literally sprayed it. You can find pictures of people standing there and like a soldier like spraying DDT on them, right? Like on their head. So it worked so well in the war. Paul Mueller, the, I guess, inventor or whatever, he won a Nobel Prize for it in 1948. The Nobel Committee, again, we've already disparaged the Nobel Prize in this, the Peace Prize, at least in this in this episode. So, but 1948, a far cry from Obama and Yasser Arafat. The Nobel Committee said, DDT has been used in large quantities with the evacuation of concentration camps of prisoners and deportees. Without any doubt, this material has already preserved the life and health of hundreds of thousands. This is in 1948. So after the war, people started to use DDT commercially. And immediately after the war, according to this guy, and according to Robert Zubin, who cites, he like has sources, so you can look at the sources. Between 1 and 6 million Americans contracted malaria annually. In 1946, the U.S. Public Health Service initiated a campaign to wipe out malaria through the application of DDT to the interior walls of homes. The results were dramatic. In the first half of 1952, there were only 2 confirmed cases of malaria contracted within the United States. So let's get that. Wow. It went from 1 to 6 million to 2.
Wow.
Amazing. In Europe, malaria was virtually eradicated by the mid-1950s. South African cases of malaria quickly dropped by 80%. Sri Lanka reduced its malaria incidence from 2.8 million Malarian cases in 1946 to 17 in 1963. India cut its malaria death rate almost to 0. In 1955, the UN World Health Organization launched a global campaign to use DDT to eradicate malaria. And it was implemented successfully in most of the developing world at that point. Latin America, Asia, like it cut rates by like more than 99%. So everything's going peachy-dory. DDT, hunky-dory, it's peachy. DDT is a godsend. It's saving millions and millions of lives at this point. It's saving millions of lives. And Rachel Carson, who was a former marine biologist turned nature writer, writes this book called Silent Spring, which reminds me of some of the feminist literature that you've talked about, where there's like this utopia in the future. Although, you know, here's what the world could be, right? Although she paints a dystopia in which the birds are all dead because of DDT, and thus we don't hear their bird song anymore, with thus the title Silent Spring. The spring is quiet because there's no birds. And she had a couple major arguments. One of them was that DDT causes cancer in humans. The other one was that it was endangering U.S. birds with extinction, particularly the robin. She was saying it's killing birds and it's going to cause cancer in humans. It's causing cancer in humans. Now, let's be clear, she had no evidence for this. Her evidence was anecdotal. This was bullcrap. No evidence. In fact, when the book came out, the National Academy of Sciences was a little bit worried that her book would create hysteria. So it issued a statement. Here's the statement from the National Academy of Sciences. Quote, "To only a few chemicals does man owe as great a debt as to DDT. It has contributed to the great increase in agricultural productivity while sparing countless humanity from a host of diseases, most notably perhaps scrub typhus and malaria. Indeed, it is estimated that in little more than 2 decades, DDT has prevented 500 million deaths due to malaria that would otherwise have been inevitable. 500 million. Abandonment of this valuable insecticide should be undertaken only at such a time and in such places as it is evident that the prospective gain to humanity exceeds the consequent losses. At this writing, all available substitutes for DDT are both expensive per crop year and decidedly more hazardous." So, we had an EPA, though. EPA got formed in 1971 right after this, newly formed EPA. They decide they're going to launch an investigation into DDT. The investigation lasted 7 months. They had investigative hearings led by a guy named Judge Sweeney. He gathered testimony from 125 expert witnesses with 365 exhibits. Like I said, it took 7 months. The conclusion was the opposite of what the environmentalists wanted. After assessing all the evidence, Judge Sweeney said, quote, "The uses of DDT under the registration involved here do not have a deleterious effect on freshwater fish, estuarine organisms, wild birds, or other wildlife. DDT is not a carcinogenic hazard to man. DDT is not a mutagenic or teratogenic hazard to man." He ruled that DDT should remain available for use. But the administrator of the EPA, William Ruckelshaus, who reportedly did not attend a single hour of the investigative hearings, and according to his chief of staff, did not even read Judge Sweeney's report overruled Sweeney and in 1972 banned the use of DDT in the United States. So, I just want to review something here. By the way, this probably killed millions of people across the globe. These environmentalists kill people. Bad environmentalist policy kills people. And it's pseudoscience. So Carson's main claims, the three main claims, two focus in her book, and one really became more popular after she died. But the three main claims were, one, DDT causes cancer in humans. That's just not true. In fact, there's more details in this, but I'll just give a quick summary. In 2002, the U.S. government reported that there's no clear evidence that exposure to DDT or DDE, which is a derivative, causes cancer in humans. There's not evidence. There's no evidence. It's just not true. It's a lie. The second big thing she said was this endangered U.S. birds with extinction. Well, she said that since the introduction of DDT after World War II, the U.S. bird populations were falling and were in rapid decline. And she specifically said the robin was threatened with extinction. That was a lie. The Audubon Society counts birds. They counted birds in 1941 before DDT, and they counted birds in 1960 at the height of DDT usage. And the number of birds that they counted quadrupled since 1960. In other words, the bird population had been going up when she was raising the alarm bell about birds suffering from DDT. In fact, the robin, who she was particularly concerned about, the population of the robin increased 12-fold. Her claims about the effect on birds have been thoroughly debunked. Now, later on, after this, there was an effect that she didn't know about on certain birds that were not on her radar that she didn't know. There is an effect on, because of biomagnification, actually, at the top of the food chain on raptors, it can make their shells thinner and more vulnerable. I'm
looking up stuff right here about pelicans and
top of the food chain birds, right? So pelicans eat fish, right? They're top of the food chain. Raptors, pelicans. However, the levels of malaria levels of DDT required to kind of control, like for crop dusting or something in the 1950s, like the levels that we need to actually control malaria are much less than that. And you have to ask the question, okay, are some thinner eggshells on raptor birds and those kind of birds, are they worth millions of human deaths? We're going to ban it everywhere. Maybe we don't use it for crop dusting in high concentrations. Okay, fine. But she was wrong. None of her data was correct. Even if later on someone found out this stuff, that was not her argument. She did not talk about eggshell thinning. She did not talk about raptors. Those were not on her list. In fact, the birds that she was worried about, it probably helped because it stopped insect-borne diseases that the birds were getting.
So I just want to, I don't know anything about this book. I haven't read it, and this is new to me, but just doing a brief search.
It's an old book.
Yeah. I mean, I'm coming up with articles, including one in Time, that says the World Health Organization says that exposure to insecticides, DDT, can cause cancer. According to findings released by the World Health Organization, the chemicals have been linked specifically to non-Hodgkin lymphoma, testicular cancer, and liver cancer.
When?
This is an article from 2015.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The point is, my point is not that there's not been more research, and
right.
My guess is that maybe there's some stuff going on. My point is, at the time, she lied. She used anecdotes and she lied, and it was taken as fact, and it killed people. All right. So I mean, I don't know. I'm maybe there's studies that say that it is linked to some things. The only links I've ever seen, which is maybe what they're linking to, is if like you put super high concentrations in rats, they develop tumors, but other mammals it hasn't worked. Like it hasn't. So I don't know if those are links to humans or not. So the last big claim.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to do the last big claim. The last big claim was that DDT threatened the life of the oceans. The argument here was that, and this was pushed by Charles Worster, co-founder of the Environmental Defense Fund, in a note published in Science magazine in 1968. he said that he had claimed to have showed the presence of 500 parts per billion of DDT in seawater would stop photosynthesis by phytoplankton, which is a huge deal, right? Because photoplankton, if that stops, like everything else above it in the food chain is disrupted massively. The problem is the maximum solubility of DDT in water is 1.2 parts per billion, so you couldn't possibly ever get to 500 parts per billion. In order for him to do his experiments, he had to mix it with alcohol, which, I imagine did hurt the phytoplankton in his experiments and maybe did stop them from photosynthesizing. So my point here isn't that I'm sure there's nuanced research about the effects of DDT or other things on things. My point here is that it was saving millions of lives. The science was telling us that her claims were not true. And her claims weren't true. And we banned it anyway. And we did it because of propaganda. And we did it because we didn't follow the science. We followed scientists or people claiming to speak on behalf of science. And the thing that bothers me about using this example for kids is it teaches them to substitute the opinions of credentialed people for actual science. Later on we discerned a few things about DDT. I don't think anything that we've learned about DDT remotely justifies not using it to stop malaria, like remotely. I mean, you've got a way, on the one hand, you're willing to kill millions of people by not doing it. On the other hand, I mean, it might be a moot point now because maybe there's other chemicals that we don't need. But we're talking about at the time. This was in like 1970, right? In the early 70s. How many millions of people died because we banned DDT? And we banned DDT because it was propaganda. It was propagandized by someone who used the name of science, ignored actual science, and killed millions of people. And now we're using this as an example to teach. The example that this should teach kids is that science can be used as propaganda. You should, your job is to be a scientist and follow the data. Rachel Carson should have been laughed out of public eye. The EPA should have said, oh yeah, we've studied it, it's fine. If later data comes along, fine, you change your attitude about it. But they killed millions of people. This is like using a book on flat Earth as an example of good astronomy. Her book is not an example of good science. It's an example of science propaganda. That's what it was. It wasn't good science at all. And that's what they're teaching your kids in school. They're taking science propaganda and saying, here's science. And that's what really bothered me.
Here's my pushback. I haven't read the book, so I can't argue with you on that because I don't know if the book was propaganda or not. I'm just taking your word for it. What I will say, though, is that, okay, here, let me see. I'm trying to articulate this correctly. There was someone who responded to me on Twitter or something about the last question in my trigonometry interview, where they always ask everyone what's something that no one's talking about that we should talk about. And I said something about we're not talking about the possible psychological impact of wearing masks collectively to people. And this person started talking to me on Twitter about that and saying, there's no negative effect of wearing a mask. What are you talking about? And this to me is a lack of imagination, like we talked about earlier, with leftists seeming to be unable to project forward and to imagine anything that they can't currently see happening, or to just because I don't know what the psychological impact is of wearing the mask like this, like we're doing. I don't know what it is on small children who haven't seen anything different. But I can imagine that there could be bad effects that we haven't even considered or talked about. So
how does that relate to this?
I'm trying to, let me just sew it back home. So do you not see someone saying, hey, yes, this chemical, by the way, there's a dinging that keeps happening on your end.
Well, that's my fault. Sorry.
Yeah. But do you not see this as someone at the time saying, hey, this chemical has helped to, yes, it's saved millions of people's lives, but maybe we should project forward a little bit, have a bit of imagination, and ask questions about what are the negative impacts Like we're just looking at the positive ones. It's almost like
I mean,
the
of
COVID
course,
vaccine.
but that's not at all what's happening here.
Okay.
If someone sat down and said, well, we should look at the negative effects, they did, by the way, and they didn't find the negative effects they did look at them and they didn't find them. And the negative effects she talked about didn't exist. So like you're talking about something that was saving millions of lives and you're like, well, can't we just rely on some imagination and ban it?
No, I'm not saying ban it. I'm saying, don't put words in my mouth. I'm saying, do you not view someone talking about possible negative effects as being similar to...
I'm not saying you don't talk about possible negative effects. Like, sure, you talk about possible negative effects. Of course you have that conversation. And if you really feel like it's a problem, you keep doing research there and you look for other things and you sure, of course you do. That's science. I'm not complaining about that. Has nothing to do with Rachel Carson or banning of DDT. That's completely unrelated. Rachel Carson and banning with DDT was, I wrote a fictional book with an imagination where there's a silent spring. Therefore, let's ban this thing that's helping millions of people because we have no scientific data about it. That's what they did.
Was the book fiction?
I mean, kind of, yeah. It was like a novel. Yes, it was she made claims about what was happening in reality. It was like a mix, right? So it wasn't really fiction. She was saying this is happening, but here's a scenario. That the Silent Spring part was fiction, where she's like, here's a scenario, right?
Okay.
But you can't write. I don't want to say this. I'm not saying you don't have the conversation. Of course you have the conversation. And if she says, I have anecdotal data about X, Y, and Z, then fine, study that. Study it. But in the meantime, it's saving millions of lives. You don't just ban something because Rachel Carson has an imagination, right? That's the problem. And that's anti-science. That's completely anti-science, right? I have some anecdotes in a book that I wrote where I imagine things are bad. We're going to ignore the actual science that was done and ban it anyway. That's the opposite of science. That's undermining science in the worst possible way. Right? Even if she had turned out to be correct, it's an undermining of science. Even if she was completely right and she had guessed. If someone writes guesswork and you take it as fact and make policy on it, that's the opposite of science. Guesswork is not science. Hysteria and propaganda are not science. That's not what they are. Even if she had been right, she didn't have the data. There was not data. And it turns out she was wrong. She was 100% wrong. The eggshell thinning thing, which is the only thing that was kind of close, was not even on her radar. It wasn't what she was talking about.
So one more pushback. And again, I have not read the book. So in Wikipedia, which also I trust about as much as I trust the World Health Organization, but they say Carson never called for an outright ban on DDT.
No, she didn't.
She said, okay.
No,
she said in Silent Spring, let me just read this part. She said in Silent Spring that even if DDT and other insecticides had no environmental side effects, their indiscriminate overuse was counterproductive because it would create insect resistance to pesticides, making them useless and eliminating the target insect populations. That's Wikipedia editorializing. Then this is the quote from the book. This is her quote. Quote, no responsible person contends that insect-borne disease should be ignored. The question that has now urgently presented itself is whether it is either wise or responsible to attack the problem by methods that are rapidly making it worse. The world has heard much of, you probably have a problem with that line, making it worse. The world has heard much of the triumphant war against disease through the control of insect vectors of infection, but it has heard little of the other side of the story, the defeats, the short-lived triumphs that now strongly support the alarming view that the insect enemy has been made actually stronger by our efforts. Even worse, we may have destroyed our very means of fighting, end quote.
Yeah, whatever. That's not my point. My point is not that she didn't think of some things that should be explored, right? And my point is this isn't science. That's not science. Okay. That's not science. They're teaching this to sixth graders as science. That's not what science is. Science is not, I think things might happen. That's not science.
I hear you. Okay.
That's not what it is. And you don't make policy based on that. And by the way, speaking of the World Health Organization, I'm reading a quote from them in 2011. their studies failed to show any convincing evidence of patterns or associations between DDT and cancer incidences or mortality. Like, I don't, did 4 years later something change? Maybe, but like, we're talking decades after this book. They were still saying no evidence. No, there's not, there's not a link. Okay. So
no, I hear you. I'm glad
I guess if a shaman in India says, it turns out that the earth is not flat, right? It revolves around the sun. We don't applaud him for science because 3,000 years later, we're like, hey, we figured it out. He was right. No, that's not science.
I hear you. Thank you for clarifying with vigor. Somebody in chat said that you're Krampus.
I'm Krampus?
You're Krampus, who's Krampus today. I think it's a new horror movie with an evil Santa Claus.
Oh, maybe. I could totally be evil Santa Claus.
No, I appreciate it. You're just making me laugh now about the shaman example.
Yeah,
I hear you.
Yeah, I get the thing for me. The thing that's bothersome to me is what you need to teach kids is that, I mean, you need to teach kids that science is a process, right? It's an intellectual process where you're studying something, you're doing experiments, you're following the scientific method, you're observing and experimenting, you're drawing conclusions about the physical world around you, right? That's what science is. And to use a book like this and say, here's an example of a science. This is a scientific thing that's happening. Someone wrote a piece of shit book. Right. Everyone ignored the actual science and made policy that killed millions of people on it. Yay, she was a woman, which, by the way, they were also doing. That's teaching children that actually credentialism and popularity matter, not the data. That's what it's teaching them. We all liked Rachel Carson. She was popular, and therefore she's correct. That's what they're teaching them, and to me it is abhorrent. It's undermining the entire purpose of science, which is to use your own mind to look at the data yourself, right? To make those decisions yourself. That's how you train little scientists. You don't train them when someone writes a popular book that people complain about or that people praise. We ignore all the data because it's a good book. Apparently it was a very good book. A lot of people liked the book, but.
Well, now I'm going to have to read it.
Sorry.
Thank you.